Welcome to meeting number 58 of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to House Order of June 23, 2022. Members are attending in person in the room as well as remotely by using the Zoom application. I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please do mute yourselves when you are not speaking. Interpretation for those on Zoom is at the bottom of your screen, and you do have a choice of either floor, English, or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Now, pursuant to the order of reference of Wednesday, November 16, 2022, the committee resumes consideration of Bill C-281, an act to amend the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Act, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, the Broadcasting Act, and the Prohibiting Cluster Munitions Act. It is now my pleasure to welcome officials who will be supporting this consideration of clause by clause of Bill C-281. From the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, we have Ms. Marie-Josée Langlois, the Director General, Strategic Policy Branch. We have Mr. Jeffrey Martyr, the Executive Director of Human Rights and Indigenous Affairs. We have Ms. Ashlyn Milligan, the Acting Executive Director for Non-Proliferation, Disarmament and Space. And we have from the Department of Canadian Heritage, Ms. Amy Awad, the Senior Director, Marketplace and Legislative Policy. I'd like to provide members of the committee with some instructions and a few comments on how the committee will proceed with the clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-281. As the name indicates, this is an examination of all the clauses in the order in which they appear in the bill. I will call each clause successively, and each clause is subject to debate and a vote. If there are amendments to the clause in question, I will recognize the member proposing it, who may explain it. The amendment will then be open for debate. When no further member wishes to intervene, the amendment will be voted on. Amendments will be considered in the order in which they appear in the bill or in the package each member has received from the clerk. Members should note that amendments must be submitted in writing to the clerk of the committee. I will go slowly to allow all members to follow the proceedings properly. Amendments have been given an alphanumeric number in the top right corner to indicate which party submitted them. There is no need for a seconder to move an amendment. Once moved, you will need unanimous consent to withdraw it. During debate on an amendment, members are permitted to move sub-amendments. These sub-amendments must be submitted in writing. They do not require the approval of the mover of the amendment. Only one sub-amendment may be considered at a time, and that sub-amendment cannot be amended. When a sub-amendment is moved to an amendment, it is voted on first. Then another sub-amendment may be moved, or the committee may consider the main amendment and vote on it. Once every clause has been voted on, the committee will vote on the title and the bill itself, and an order to reprint the bill may be required if amendments are adopted, so that the House has a proper copy for use at report stage. Finally, the committee will have to order the chair to report the bill to the House. That report contains only the text of any adopted amendments, as well as an indication of any deleted clauses. Now, at this point, allow me to thank the officials for their attendance and guidance during this clause-by-clause consideration of Bill C-281. Now, each of you has received the package. It's fairly copious. It's about 30 pages, so I would recommend everyone follow these. Now, going to the agenda, we will go through clause by clause. So, pursuant to Standing Order 75-1, consideration of Clause 1, which is the short title, will be postponed. So, we will now proceed to Clause 2. Would anyone like to speak to Clause 2? Yes, Mr. Oliphant?
Yes, I'm going to be proposing an amendment in Clause 2, and you will see that in the package as G1, an amendment to Clause 2, and that I will read it into the record, that Bill C-281 in Clause 2 be amended by replacing line 9 on page 1 to line 2 on page 2 with the following. And it would be subsection 4. At least once in every calendar year, the minister is to publish a report that outlines the measures that the minister has taken to advance human rights internationally as part of Canada's foreign policy. That is the amendment I am proposing. It is listed as G1, as I said. Just in support of that amendment, I want to reiterate that Canada is committed to supporting wholeheartedly the vital and courageous work of human rights defenders. I want to thank our officials who are with us today, who continually advise us on how we can best support those human rights defenders. If the government is required, however, and we heard this in testimony from more than one witness, if the government is required to publicize a list that actually sets out the names and circumstances of prisoners of conscience or human rights defenders who are detained anywhere in the world, or persons detained in contravention to human rights standards, even while we are supporting them very, very strongly, it's not guaranteed that that will actually help them, and in fact, we believe it could hinder their future. A publicized list that sets out the names and circumstances of such prisoners of conscience or human rights defenders detained worldwide, or persons detained in contravention to human rights standards, could actually impede our diplomatic actions. It could cause them grave harm, and Canada's support for these individuals could actually potentially endanger their safety, and in more serious cases could actually lead to their deaths. Moreover, the colloquial term prisoner of conscience does not have an agreed international or domestic legal definition, and so we're concerned about that. It's even in lowercase, as though we understand it. I think we have an intuitive sense to it, but this is a piece of legislation. It's not a report, Mr. Chair, and that's why we are concerned. We recommend that the listing requirement be removed. We also heard from Alex Neve, formerly of Amnesty International, that it's not only the listing of people that could cause them harm, but the not listing of others that Canada is not necessarily engaged with, but other countries may be engaged with, could further their harm as well, because a government could assume then that they're not a prisoner of conscience because they're not on Canada's list. And so we want to remove the listing requirement. And we recommend that the listing requirement be removed and replaced with generalized information on activities taken in support of human rights defenders in the annual Human Rights Report. This I would say, too, I think that the helpful part of the bill is requiring that report. And we recognize it will take a lot of work, it will take effort, but we think that that is important. It could include reference to emblematic cases, cases that perhaps have been resolved satisfactorily, or cases that have not been resolved satisfactorily, where there's consent from a number of parties, including the individual, him or herself, or themselves, and their family, and also a contextual understanding of the nature of the incarceration or the detention. And we want to do that so that no harm will be caused. We recognize that there are families that would like the names of prisoners of conscience or human rights defenders to be listed. We recognize that that is something that they can list them at any time in their own lives on social media or in broader media, but government has a different responsibility. And the government responsibility here is to ensure that all of our activities will not cause harm, but will actually help the people that we are trying to help. We continually do these sorts of cases. I've been involved in a number of them myself personally, when members of the opposition or members of our own caucus come to us to ask for help with a particular case. It could be a Canadian who is detained. It could be a permanent resident of Canada who's detained. It could be a non-citizen who's detained. Someone with no relationship to Canada but is working as a human rights defender, or a journalist who is also a human rights defender, or anyone else. The government takes that seriously, and we work through our missions and through qualified personnel to do that. But we also recognize that megaphone diplomacy in this way is often counterproductive to what I think we all want to do, which is both to protect their lives and also often to further their cause. Even if we disagree with their cause, we may want to always ensure that their lives are protected. So that's why we're moving G1, and it significantly reduces Clause 2. I recognize that, but it will require the minister to publish a report that will show how the minister, whoever the minister is at any time, what they're doing to advance human rights as part of our foreign policy. Those are my comments on G1. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Oliphant. We now go to Mr. Jenis.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be brief. I agree with some of the things Mr. Oliphant said. I agree that there is some benefit to amending this section. We do not support the government's amendment here, though, as we feel that it wholly guts the section, and we would prefer an amendment that provides some flexibility around listing, but still requires the government to be more transparent around aspects that can be revealed. In the vast majority of cases, having that information out there as a means of holding the government accountable and as a means of projecting the importance of these cases is valuable. But we will be supportive of other amendments that make this section more flexible, but still do, but don't go fully in the direction of gutting any requirement to provide any information whatsoever in relation to prisoners of conscience.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
I'll try to be brief, Mr. Chair. I simply want to say this. I certainly understand the arguments that have been put forward by our colleague, but we will not vote in favor of this amendment for several reasons. The first being no one can see in the amendment the will of the government to have an indication of less accountability or more accountability. That would have been preferable. And secondly, because Mr. Neve, for example, was not opposed, and far from it, to the idea of publishing a list. Clearly, there are concerns with respect to the publication of a list, and we're very aware of that. In fact, I myself put this question to Mr. Neve on this matter. And we are sensitive to the concerns that are involved with the publication of a list, but trying to limit to the minimum what would be contained in some future report about the measures that have been taken to promote human rights on the international scene seems a bit brief, a bit short to me. And I think, and I understand that this is a motion that is in order, but it doesn't seem to me to fit into the spirit of this bill, and so we will vote against this amendment.
Would anyone else like to speak to this? I do understand that a number of different amendments have been put forward with respect to Clause 2. I've had the benefit of having spoken to the legislative assistant, who I suspect is very well known to all of you. And I've been advised that if G1 is adopted, NDP Amendment Number 1, CPC Amendment Number 1, and BQ Amendment Number 1 cannot be moved due to the a line conflict, since any given line can only be amended once. So I just thought I would advise all the members of this before we decide whether G1 shall carry. Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Furthering in our discussion on that, I recognize this. I would like to give a chance. There's two questions I have that I'm not sure we got from officials, because we saw officials early in the consideration of the bill, and to turn to the officials to ask them, as nonpartisan officials, their understanding of the implications of publishing a list of names of human rights defenders and prisoners of conscience that Canada may be assisting with. And also, if they have done discussions with the Privacy Commissioner, and perhaps our Legislative Council could help us understand if there's been any consideration of privacy laws that could be implied or be implicated in this discussion. Those are two questions I would have to help me understand this. Thank you.
Assistant, is there any particular official you had in mind, or should I just open it up to...
I would say it's probably Mr. Martyr, but
yes,
they can
Martyr.
decide among themselves.
Mr. Martyr, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, for the question. As indicated, publishing a list... Whenever Canada engages in support of human rights defenders or people imprisoned abroad in violation of international human rights standards, we do that in partnership with other countries, sometimes with civil society partners. And the strategy to approach the engagement on each individual case is decided collectively based on local situation and based on the particularities of each individual case. Typically, we would come up with a strategy that is based on opportunities for escalation, and in some cases, indeed, publishing the name of someone imprisoned against their will abroad. It would be important to go public with that information, but typically, we come up with a strategy that is based on an escalatory approach with potentially naming an individual case as the final step. So you always being forced to publish names of cases that we were engaged on could threaten the actual engagement on the specific case. It could also jeopardize the partnerships with other countries that are critical to engaging on cases, as if other countries that were partnering with Canada were aware that we would, by force, were legislatively obligated to publish the names of individuals on whose behalf we were engaged. It could potentially make them more reluctant to engage with Canada collectively on supporting these cases. There are also certainly as indicated, we have not been in conversations with the Privacy Commissioner, but we would certainly have to be guided by the Privacy Act, which could place limits on the amount of information that would be allowed to be divulged. So basically, in terms of an overall strategy, which is guided by partnerships on the ground with other countries, being forced to publish proactively information of individual names could jeopardize the partnerships that we have on the ground and our ability to engage effectively on cases. And I would note that quiet diplomacy should not be underestimated as a critical factor in engaging on individual cases. And some countries that typically would not be traditional partners of Canada, I would refer to them as non-traditional partners, take approaches that favor quiet diplomacy as opposed to louder megaphone diplomacy. And these sorts of broad partnerships in many instances, are critical to effective engagement on individual cases. And I would see those sorts of partnerships that could be put particularly at risk with an obligation to publish not just names but details of activities that we were engaged on individual cases. Thank you.
Mr. Martyr, is there any other official who would like to speak to these two issues? Oh, okay. Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Just as a follow-up to that, I know that there are a series of like-minded countries, and I sometimes call them the usual suspects, that we engage with on these files. And then there are, as Mr. Martyr said, other countries that may not be the usual partners engaged. Do either of those countries, do we know of legislation in any of those countries that requires them to publish lists of people that they are working with?
Yeah, I am not aware of any legislative obligations to publish lists of names of people on whose behalf other governments are actively engaged. I would note many are probably familiar with the comprehensive human rights reports published every year by the State Department, which detail human rights situations in countries around the world. And I am not aware, based on my observation and reading of many of those reports, of details other than perhaps emblematic cases that are broad public knowledge, but of any detailed information on specific cases that are being acted upon. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now we will have to decide whether G1 shall...
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Just a further question.
Yes, Mr. Zubair.
So this list, let's say we hypothetically were to enact it right now, or into the future, I should say. And let's say Canada is advocating on behalf of non-citizens. Given the information you have right now, do you think that this list, the scope of it, would require us to put out the names of non-citizens, permanent residents, and also people who have no status in Canada, be it a visa, be it residency or citizenship? Say we're doing quiet diplomacy with other partners.
I mean, my understanding of the way it is written is that we would be required, the requirement is to publish the lists of names of all, I think the term is prisoners of conscience, on whose behalf the government of Canada is actively engaged to support them or seek their release. So it seems quite clear-cut and broad.
I guess to be clear, that would include anybody, including non-citizens, non-permanent residents, people who don't have a visa in Canada.
That's my understanding.
I would just, if I can,
Yes, Mr.
just
Zhang.
opine slightly. You know, we've heard a lot of testimony in this committee around the delicate nature of this, and we know all of us, I think, take this issue of championing and advocating for individuals in extremely oppressive circumstances very seriously. And if I'd ask the committee members to reflect upon the fact that if we publish those names, we may actually cause very serious and irreparable harm to them. And so I would ask the committee members to err on the side of caution in this particular instance, given that it's a substantive change that can cause very serious damage to individuals, including their lives. Many of us around this table have advocated for individuals privately and publicly. And that's not to take away from the intent at all of Mr. Lawrence's bill, but this is just a reflection born out of the fruit of testimony, which I personally am quite hesitant to vote, obviously, in favor of this, the original text. And I ask that we support this amendment as a result of that. Thank you.
Mr. Zuberi, I think the other thing we should highlight is Mr. Martyr did say that no other country is actually known to do otherwise and to provide a full list of all the individuals that are being assisted and of the other countries that engage in terms of speaking up on their behalf, given that Canada likes to reach out to other like-minded countries to assist.
If I
But
may add
that
one,
having been said,
one
yes.
final thing. You know, the salutary aspect of this amendment is that it still requires a reporting mechanism. It still requires a reporting mechanism, which does advance the issue.
Thank you, Mr. Zuberi. Yes, Ms. McPherson.
I think that there is a lot of support within the room for us to make some changes to the legislation to this. I don't think that there is support for the Liberals' amendment at this point. It is too broad. It is too overarching. I do think that perhaps we could have a short recess to just sort of talk through some of the amendments. But I also would be interested in knowing if, Mr. Chair, if you've received any information that there may be any challenges with any other of the amendments to this particular clause.
Yes, there have been a number of other amendments that have been ruled out of scope by the legislative Kirk.
Could you provide a little bit more detail about which amendments were going to be ruled out of scope? I think that is relevant because it will make a difference on how we choose to go forward with.
For sure. Let me actually turn to the legislative clerk and see if... So just having had an opportunity to speak to the legislative clerk. He has advised that the routine approach to this is that an amendment has to be moved first before any such information can be provided.
In the interest of producing the best piece of legislation we can, would you be willing to give us a 2-minute suspension of the meeting so we can?
Absolutely, of course. I'll give you 5 minutes if.
Your 5 minutes is 10 minutes, so let's do my 2 minutes, which is your 5 minutes.
Fair enough. 2 minutes of suspension. Yes, Ms. McPherson.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to propose an amendment to G1 if I could. And I would propose I'll just read what the amendment would be. That Bill C-281 in Clause 2 be amended by replacing line 12 on page 1 to line 2 on page 2 with the following. In every calendar year, a report that includes an outline of the measures that the minister has taken to advance human rights internationally as part of Canada's foreign policy. B, a list that sets out the following information related to prisoners who are detained or experiencing other treatment in contravention of international human rights standards and for whose release the Government of Canada is actively working. I, the number of prisoners detained by each government or detaining authority. 2I. 1, 2, the circumstances of the detentions, and 3, the efforts that the Government of Canada has made to visit prisoners and to attend their trials or hearings, including the number of requests made for such visits and the responses of the detaining governments or authorities. So, Mr. Chair, the reason that I'm bringing this forward is I think what we see in this room is that the government has brought forward an amendment that would take out the obligation to provide a list, and we agree that we need to protect the safety of those that might be on that list. We agree that I think nobody in this room wants to see prisoners or detainees harmed because they were included in the list. However, this does give us more of the information that we require so that we are able to do our job as parliamentarians, that families are able to get the information that they require. And this is very much based on some of the testimony that we heard. This is something that was suggested by Alex Neve. This is something that was suggested to change that list of names to the number of prisoners detained. This is because the fears of naming the prisoners could cause harm. It also gives us more accountability to those families, and this is something that we did hear was sorely lacking with the government response to date.
Chair, just a point of order. Could we get clarity on the text of the amendment? Is it the same as the text of? Well, maybe just.
And I do.
Yes,
Sorry,
if you could.
Maybe it could just be read. It could be read
the
again.
record one more time.
And C, a description of the efforts that the minister has made to improve consistency and transparency in human rights advocacy and to improve accountability to the families of those detained and to civil society. My apologies, sir.
I think on the point of order. So it's not a debate, it'll be on a point of order. This is a point of order, maybe following on Mr. Genes's point of order. My problem is that is presented as an amendment to the bill as it stands in Section 2, and yet now it doesn't really make sense because it's amending G1. So I am having trouble rationalizing between the amendment of G1 and the amendment of NDP1
Sub-amendment.
as though it's an amendment to G1. And I think that this doesn't really work because G1 already starts replacing from line 9, and so that is removed. But the problem is that the NDP 1 starts from line 12. That's just one of the examples of the problem. We're not necessarily opposed to it, but I would like you to rule on whether it's actually a sub-amendment, an amendment to the amendment, and whether or not it is in order in scope, those two issues.
That's a very fair point. I understand the legislative clerk would like to speak to the technicalities of the issue as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. To Ms. McPherson, I had a question for you regarding your sub-amendment.
Your voice is very quiet.
Oh, I'm sorry. I can come closer. So on your sub-amendment, it should amend G1 in one way or another. And it seems that your sub-amendment is actually amending the text of the bill, but not G1. That was the point that Mr. Oliphant was making, and I had the same issue with your sub-amendment.
So I would be removing paragraph 4 the at least once every calendar year, and then I would be replacing it with in every calendar year report that includes.
Legislative clerk, once again.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. McPherson, that would be considered, it would not be considered a sub-amendment because you're replacing the amendment of the government by your own. So the course of action would be to defeat the government amendment first and then propose your amendment after that.
I have a question.
Yes, Mr. Zuberi.
I'm just curious, a point of order. Just curious if this amendment succeeds, will it be in scope in relation to legislation? The sub-amendment. Out of order. My apologies. Does not exist. DNE. That's cool. Thank you.
So do you want to ask the legislative clerk that question?
I'll ask as a hypothetical.
Absolutely. Let's go to the legislative clerk.
No.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm not sure what the question is. If G1 is admissible, is that what the question?
I withdraw it. I withdraw that. Thank you.
Okay, so do we want to, does G1 carry? Yes, can we have a recorded vote, please? Starting from Mr. Sarai, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Sarai?
Yes.
Mr. El Khoury?
Yes.
Mr. Oliphant?
Yes.
Mr. Zuberi?
Yes.
Mr. McKay?
Oh, come on, Johnny.
Mr. Guinness? Mr. Guinness?
No.
Mr. Abul Taif?
No.
Mr. Deltel?
No.
Mr. Obak?
No.
Monsieur Bergeron?
No.
Ms. McPherson?
No.
Yeas 5, nays 6.
Thank you. So we now move to NDP Amendment 1.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I think we all know that what we were trying to incorporate into G1 to make that fit. This is basically, an attempt to protect people from being on the list, and if that is a situation that would cause danger to anyone. We did hear from Mr. Lawrence. He spoke to many experts who many families who wanted to have their loved ones on that list. But we also spoke to experts that said that was dangerous. We've heard from our experts today that have said that there is situations where quiet diplomacy is a much stronger approach to take to get help for individuals. This is a way for us to still get the information that we require, but that it is allowing the government to have some anonymity for that. So really, this is two things. This is allowing us to get the information that we want, but it is ensuring that there's accountability for the families and for civil society that are working so hard on behalf of detained individuals.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Could I ask for the legislative clerk to advise us with respect to whether or not this amendment is in the scope of the bill or outside the scope of the bill, and then have a chair's ruling on that, please?
Legislative clerk, would you like to speak to that, or?
I will defer to you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, this is Clause 2 of Bill 2C281 amends the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development Act to add an obligation to publish a report that lists the names and circumstances of prisoners of conscience detained worldwide for whose release the Government of Canada is actively working. The amendment seeks to expand that list to all prisoners who are detained or experiencing other treatments in contravention of international human rights standards. Also, the amendment provides more accountability to the families of the detained and to civil society. These are new concepts not envisioned in the bill when it was originally adopted by the House at second reading. As House of Commons Procedures and Practice 3rd edition states on page 770, an amendment to a bill that was referred to committee after second reading is out of order if it is beyond the scope and principle of the bill. In the opinion of the chair, and for the above stated reason, the amendment is a new concept that is beyond the scope of the bill. Therefore, I rule the amendment inadmissible. Yes, Ms. McPherson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I don't agree with this ruling. With all due respect, I think that one of the things that I think has been missed here is that the prisoners of conscience description is being seen as something I don't think it is. This was something that Alex Neve suggested made very good sense. It was within how we are working within the definitions. So from my perspective, that's not. It does not change the scope of the bill. So I really do. I do really think that we need to have been the ability to listen to the experts that came before us. We need the ability to change the language insofar as the prisoner of conscience phrasing is in place. I don't want you to take this the wrong way, but I'm going to challenge the chair on this ruling.
So are you appealing this decision? Are you challenging this decision?
Yes, I'm challenging the decision.
Okay.
Just a point of order.
Yes.
I just want to understand a procedural issue, and this is very important. So if the committee overturns the chair's ruling, it is still possible for the speaker to rule the amendment out of scope when this goes to the House. If that happens, then are we automatically back to the original version of the section, or is it possible for us to have, an alternative amendment in the event that the speaker rules it out of order? Because I guess my concern is I agree with Ms. McPherson's interpretation, but if we overturn the chair's ruling and then the speaker overturns that overturn, then we are in a position where we can't move further amendments to the section. So I guess what does it revert to? And maybe we get some guidance on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, Mr. Janus, you are quite right. If the decision is overturned today, once the bill goes back to the House at report stage, any member could raise a point of order in the House to challenge the fact that some amendments were ruled inadmissible, and even though they made their way to the reports, the Speaker could, if he chooses to do so, to rule the amendment also inadmissible, and at that point he may remove them from the reports and ask for a new reprint of the bill, and we would go back to what the bill is now. unless there were other amendments adopted.
Just some additional clarity. If that was the case, we would be able to bring amendments forward at that point. Is that correct?
It's hard to answer that question. Usually at report stage, only amendments that are further amending amendments that were adopted in committee are permissible to some extent. What the note to Standing Order 75 says, basically, what can be done in committee should be done in committee. So it's hard to answer your question on that issue.
But if it is the will of the committee to overthrow. I would never do it. To overturn the decision of the chair, would that not be the will of the committee? It seems like that's contradictory. On one hand, you can't change things that have happened in committee because the committee must do what can be done at committee, but yet overturning the decision of committee doesn't allow committee to do what can be done in committee.
I understand. It's
the way it is. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Just on the point of order, just to follow up on the procedural question, if this amendment is passed by this committee, it is then ruled that would preclude other amendments from being moved, and then if we revert back to the original in the House, members may be able to make the argument that they weren't able to move amendments at committee, and therefore they should be able to move that in the House. But we're into procedurally uncharted territory without precedent there. Is that fair to say, or are there precedents that maybe the Speaker would allow report stage amendments to the original, given that those amendments couldn't have been moved at committee because other amendments were moved that were... Maybe the answer is we don't know, but are there precedents that can guide us here or not?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have done that being a legislative clerk for quite a number of years, so I don't have any examples of the question you're asking. However, the amendment that is before the committee right now was ruled inadmissible by the chair. So there would be an opportunity to move other amendments unless the decision is overturned.
Order. It would seem to me that an understanding of the rules would be that if the House has adopted the bill at second reading, therefore, and the committee does its work, and at report stage, amendments are generally, in my experience, restricted to amending the amendments that were made at committee. So, as opposed to that. So, but there are other avenues, I would think, that could be done. My sense is that if the chair was overruled and this was put in order, we may find a way in this committee to pull it back into scope and have it stand. Am I being a little cryptic? I'm trying not to be cryptic. The reality is there is some common ground in here somewhere. I think the government's position and the Liberal caucus position is we think the bill as written is dangerous. We don't think it's neutral. We think it endangers lives, and no less than that. And that comes from our officials who are professionals in this field, It comes from civil society who have cautioned us. And frankly, it comes very personally from my work in doing this now for 4 years, and working and negotiating with other countries, with like-minded countries, with not like-minded countries to save people's lives. And in fact, we did that very recently with 2 non-Canadian citizens who were, well, one permanent resident of Canada who was in a difficult, life-threatening situation. If that name had been published, we would not have saved his life. I am 100% sure of that. So we will do everything we can to find a way to make transparency, to enable the thing. But for us, the issue is not Parliament feeling good about what it's doing. That is absolutely offensive to some of us. What it is absolutely trying to save people's lives because it's not about us. So I will go on at length about this. I think there is a way we could probably find a solution to this. I was very much open to a real amendment to G1 to find a way, but substituting NDP 1 for G1, which is out of scope, is not the way to do it. So I think that if we've now at that point where we've not yet defeated G1, I think there is a way to appropriately amend G1. That would be my first goal, is to... Oh, yes. I'm sorry. So we've defeated G1. We can't go back to that one. We now have an out-of-scope amendment, and maybe there's another amendment that could be presented that we could find common ground on. But I also think that it is incumbent upon us to listen to experienced legislative counsel. That is the legislative clerk's job, is to tell us those things. So I get a bit passionate about this because I do believe there are lives at stake.
We're going to Mr. Bergeron, which we will. Just wanted to advise the members that should the members deem it necessary, we can rescind our decision on G1. So that's one thing for everyone to consider. I'm just saying it's one thing to consider. I'm not saying you should do it, but I'm saying that's one thing to consider. Now we go to Mr. Bergeron.
Microphone, please. I think it's important to point out, first of all, that I sincerely believe, Mr. Oliphant, that everyone around this table agrees with the fact that we don't want to simply draw up a list of names without any type of parameters or safeguards that would put people in danger. There is a common will around here to find a solution. But perhaps the most simple way of proceeding, Mr. Oliphant, would be to ask you, between CPC 1 and BQ 1, is there a proposal that would be acceptable in your eyes? And if that were the case, perhaps we could proceed that way, because I know that on the opposition side, we want to proceed with one or the others of the amendments. So would there be one of these amendments that would be acceptable to you, and that would allow us to proceed quite quickly with the drafting of a motion and add the safeguards that are necessary? It would allow the government not to name people who should not be named because of their endangerment.
I believe it's still on the question of whether or not the NDP 1 is in order. So I'm going to be completely transparent on this now. Of all the amendments, G1 is obviously our favorite. But we could support NDP 1 most likely. We may offer an amendment to it. But as a starting point among NDP 1, CPC 1, and BQ 1, the one that we would find the most similarity to our values is with NDP 1. So the only way to get there, you can tell, is to have the chair's ruling overturned and allow NDP 1 to be moved, and then we would work to amend NDP 1 to try to get to a position where we could all agree with it. That would be what we would do. I'm not advising you overturn the chair, but I'm just saying that is but that is probably our way through this. Is and let me be clear. I've been a chair of a committee for many years. The reality is the chair doesn't write those decisions. The legislative clerk writes those decisions, and they're based on years of experience. So we still agree that it is out of scope. But if it were overturned, if the ruling was overturned, we would find a way to work with that one to try to get consensus on how we have a better section, clause 2. Is it clause 2 we're in? Yes. So
Point of information. Point of information. Is this a dilatory motion that was put forth, or that was put forth around the challenging to your ruling? You said that this amendment's out of order, out of scope. Sorry, and then there was a challenge put forth to that.
No, there wasn't. We were discussing other numbers.
Discussing. Okay.
Could I ask that we suspend for a few minutes to have a little conversation? Oh.
Yes, before we suspend, if we could
Mr. Clerk, you obviously know the challenges that we're facing. I don't think any of us are being very, very secretive about this. If we were to change back the prisoners of conscience and reword the obligation to communicate with families, is there a way to make it, can you recommend a way to make NDP 1 in scope?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That would be more a question for the legislative drafter. I can look at it once I have the final product in front of me. What you're saying as an option could possibly work, but then if I had the text, I would feel more comfortable than having to provide you with the text itself.
And so we would need to, just to clarify, we would then need to have presented you with another text. Is it possible that we could, Mr. Chair, perhaps leave this clause and move to the next one and come back to this at a subsequent time?
But you will provide the text by the end of today?
Well, or, yeah, if we can.
Yeah?
Yeah, but we need to have time to discuss with the town liberals about that.
Feasible?
So we would need to suspend anyway.
As long as this is in scope, they support it, though.
Yeah, but we have to rewrite it in order it to be.
So why don't we leave it? We'll
Yep.
start rewriting it, and then we'll make some
You will
time for
rewrite
it.
it when?
Well, my team on my little computer while we're going.
Yeah, but we need to discuss with the liberals, so we need.
So the clerk has indicated, yes, that is possible. He will make every effort to bring it within scope. Can I actually suggest, because it's important that we do provide him the text for this, so can I recommend that we still do suspend, and then after the suspend, we'll give everyone like 5-10 minutes for you to work something out, and then we'll come back and just skip a section 2 and go to the next section.
Just a point of order.
Yep.
I just want to clarify whether the legislative clerk said he would do what was required to put it in the scope, as you just said. I think his job is to read what we have written or members of the committee has written, and then to evaluate whether it's in scope.
Correct.
I just you
But
said
just
he would
to
put it in
accommodate
scope.
that process, knowing how members' schedules work, I'm just saying let's try to get it figured out here today? If that's okay with the members, or you don't?
I think it might be more useful to leave this, because this is an omnibus bill. It is not an act that is amending one bill. It's an act that's amending several bills. It does, even though I hate those kinds of bills, it does give us the chance to leave a section and go to another section quite independently, because it's about another whole piece of legislation. So I think Ms. McPherson's suggestion of moving to another section of the bill makes some sense right now, because then I think we can have some discussion. We have some wording about how perhaps to help with NDP 1 to be, in principle, I still don't know whether it's in scope, because we haven't worked on that. We would actually ask the clerk to help us with scope, an evaluation of scope later. But I think we need to work on some wording here to get that done. So,
sure. My only question, completely understand everything that you have outlined, Mr. Oliphant. I'm just wondering, did you want to do it here today, or did you want to leave it till after 1 o'clock?
I don't think there's anything right now that we can look at. So we could,
Okay.
our teams could start working together on that, and,
Okay.
and maybe later on in this meeting. But at this moment, I don't think it makes sense because we don't
Okay.
have anything to look at.
Absolutely. So no need to suspend them.
No.
Okay. So, do I have to ask for a vote on that, if everyone's okay skipping to amendment number? Clause 2, and move to the next clause. Yes, Mr. Bergeron. Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
Ne devrions
Should we not, first of all, vote on the overturning of your ruling? On the overturning of your ruling, should we not first vote on the overturning of your ruling?
Or-
We didn't ever do it.
Does it stand right now? This is out of scope.
The clerk has advised that Ms. McPherson did not actually challenge, so threaten, yes. Yes, Mr.
I
Oliphant.
just,
look at the blues because I'm not quite sure.
I think the wording was a challenge, but if she's saying she's not challenging it yet, then we have some little bit of time. On this, and it really is a point of order, getting advice and counsel from the legislative clerk with respect to standing. We have an order on an agenda with respect to the motions, the amendments that are coming in. Is it, do we need to vote on the actual changing of the agenda to allow those to stand and then to move to another one? So we can just, it's up to you, up to the chair then? Okay. Good? Okay.
Okay, so now we move to,
So, Chair, I will move CPC 2, which is for a new clause 2.1.
for, so, you're not supposed to go to NDP 2?
Mr. Chair?
Yeah.
I would think it would be helpful if we moved CPC 2 after we've dealt with all of Clause 2, so we understand where we're at with respect to that piece of legislation. I know they're not exactly related, but I think it would be helpful if we moved instead to the second part of the bill and went into CPC 3, and though that part on, I think that's where we start with the sanctions part.
It's just 2.1 is not related to clause 2 at all. It's just numbered that way because it comes next, but it's not in it's in relation to the obligations to respond to a committee report. It's not in any way in relation to the subject matter of 2.1. I don't really care, but I just, for sake of argument,
I just have to read it,
it
sorry.
makes sense to go to 2.1 if we're going to go in order otherwise.
CPC 2.
Well, even if it's 2.1, it does relate to clause 2. So he's right. It does relate. Yes.
Je présume que
I would presume that Mr. Genuis's motion has been moved in due form and can be debated. But my question is this, Mr. Chair. What would the effect be? Because you see that there would be an amendment.
I just want to ensure that, it was moved, but I want to make sure that the chair has ruled that it is in scope. CPC 2. No, we can't. We can't, because we have to rule first. You have to rule first whether or not it's in scope before then he can debate it.
If that's okay, Mr. Bergeron. So having reviewed CPC 2, Clause 2 of Bill C-281.
Sorry, Chair, point of order. I haven't spoken to it yet. So
you haven't moved it, or you haven't?
I wanted to confirm that we were proceeding to that section. I would like to say a few words about it before but...
Absolutely, fair enough.
Yeah, no, just really briefly, Chair. This amendment is designed to allow a parliamentary committee to call for a state to be added under the State Immunity Act, and the listing of states would then allow action to be taken in terms of a state that's a state sponsor of terror. And many would argue that there are states that are sponsors of terror that have not been thus listed. So this would create a mechanism for a parliamentary committee to call for that listing. And it does align with other provisions of the Act that involve similar accountability. So that is the amendment. It's long, I won't read it, but that's what the amendment is about. And I think it's important and relates to the other provisions of the bill around accountability to Parliament on human rights issues.
To Mr. Jenis, now given that you have moved Clause 2, Clause 2 of Bill C-281 amends the Department of Foreign Affairs Trade and Development Act to add an obligation to publish a report outlining measures taken by the Minister to advance human rights internationally as part of Canada's foreign policy, and listing the names and circumstances of prisoners of conscience detained worldwide for whose release the Government of Canada is actively working. The amendment seeks to add a new obligation to the Minister in the case of a motion adopted by a committee of the Senate, of the House of Commons, or of both Houses of Parliament, recommending that an order be considered or made under subsection 6.12 of the State Immunity Act in relation to a foreign state, to prepare a response advising the committee whether or not the order is to be made, and sending out the reasons for the decision to the Minister to consider or make an order. This is a new concept, not envisioned in the bill when it was adopted by the House at second reading. As House of Commons Procedure and Practice, 3rd edition, states on page 770, an amendment to a bill that was referred to committee after second reading is out of order if it is beyond the scope and principle of the bill. In the opinion of the Chair, and for the above stated reason, the amendment is a new concept that is beyond the scope of the bill. Therefore, I rule the amendment inadmissible. Thank you. So, did you want to challenge it? Yes.
You're eager to be challenged, Mr. Chair? No, I actually would be happy to proceed to move CPC 3 at this time. which is
CPC
related to
3?
Clause 3.
Okay, fair enough, thank you. So we now go to CPC 3.
Yeah. So the effect of this is the bill as written says that if a committee passes a motion calling for an individual to be sanctioned or for the government to report on an individual being sanctioned, and if that committee is a committee responsible for matters related to foreign affairs, that then the minister has to provide a response in the format prescribed. What we're proposing to do with this amendment is remove the requirement that it only be a committee dealing with foreign affairs. It's come to our attention since the original drafting that there are other committees that may deal with sanctions issues and may want to make a recommendation like this. I think the most obvious one would be the Justice Committee. The Justice Committee is not responsible for matters related to foreign affairs in particular, but they would look at issues related to sanctions. And there might be other committees in the course of their work, perhaps status of women, etc., finance, who might want to make recommendations for individuals that would be sanctioned. So we propose to broaden the section to allow any committee to make that recommendation. And I know there are some other proposals for amendments to this section, and we have another amendment to propose. But for now, this is the amendment we're moving. Thank you.
Yes, Mr.
While we have concerns about this, and the concern would be generally that we think sanctions are not a standalone item, but they're put in the context of foreign policy, and they should be integrated into everything we do, and should be really considered by the committee that has the mandate and responsibility from the House of Commons to foreign policy. We can live with this. We don't think it's advisable. We don't think it's a good thing, but we recommend we recognize that we can go with it. We think it should be here. We think it should be at this committee where we have a robust and comprehensive view on foreign policy and put it together. But we will be able to support this as a measure of goodwill.
Did anyone else want to speak to CPC 3? So shall CPC 3 carry? You'd like to vote on division?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the vote is on CPC 3. Mr. Sarai.
Oui.
Mr. El Khoury. Mr. Oliphant.
Yes.
Mr. Zuberi.
Yes.
Mr. McKay.
Yes.
Mr. Guinness.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
Yes.
Monsieur Deltel.
Oui.
Mr. Aubac.
Yes.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Oui.
Ms. McPherson.
Oui.
Yeas 11, nays 0.
Yes, Mr. Janice.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'd like to now move CPC 4. CPC 4 is mainly a cleanup-oriented amendment that actually reflects some issues that I think were raised by government members in questions. This is my turn to have a show of goodwill for Mr. Oliphant. It makes two changes.
Mr. Janice, just if I may, there is a G1.1 amendment as well prior to CPC 4.
Okay. We haven't received that in our packages, Chair. So is that
Did they receive it?
It was sent.
It was sent. When was it sent?
This morning.
This
morning.
Do you have copies to distribute, Madam Clerk? Okay. So even though I had the floor and tried to move it, I can't move it if it's out of order? Is that the way this works? Or?
It goes by the agenda.
What's the?
What's that? The order in which it appears in the agenda.
Can I see a copy?
Yes.
That one, right?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so Chair, my view would be I had the floor. I moved the amendment. I wasn't aware that there's a last minute one here, but I think that since I was given the floor and I moved my amendment is on the floor.
In the first place, so we have to go by the order which was originally indicated.
But maybe I should not have moved it, but I have moved it, and so
Well,
that has now occurred. So.
Point of order, the chair
Yes,
could rule
let's-
that inadmissible because he
Inadmissible,
did.
let's go back to G1.1. Yes, Mr. Bergeron.
Point of order. I simply need this. You have to explain to me, because I'm not sure I understand, why this new amendment that we received at the very last minute should take precedence over the amendment that my colleague was trying to move and bring forward.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
I think, and if I could speak on that point of order,
I'm not sure. I didn't ask Mr. Oliphant. I asked the chair.
if it's a point of order, I can do a point of
Legislative
order.
clerk will answer your inquiry. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Monsieur Bergeron, le nouvel amendement.
With the new amendment that arrived this morning, it amends lines 14 to 30 on page 2 at the point that Mr. Jennis brought up amends line 15, and the reason therefore why we have to have G1 before Mr. Genuis's is that seriatim order of the lines.
Did you?
That's what I thought it was a point of order. Therefore, I was going to respond to the point of order, but I don't need to because the clerk has responded unless the point of order is continuing.
Mr. Bergeron, I don't believe it is. I think, Mr. Bergeron, are you satisfied?
Okay.
So
Then,
Mr. Oliphant.
then, thank you, Mr. Chair. If I have the floor, I would move that. No, not yet.
It was well. It's fine. But
he has spoken
I
to
just don't understand if it was on the floor or not. If it was it not on the floor, or can it not? Could it not be moved?
This is
Yes.
Because it's after the other one. He already ruled that.
It should not have been. It is the prerogative of the chair to say. Even prerogative to go back to what should have been the appropriate way of proceeding. Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would move then, and this would be sort of G11 or G1A, that Bill C-281 in Clause 3 be amended by replacing lines 14 to 31 on page 2 with the following. That the minister must table a response in accordance with the standing orders of the House of Commons or the rules of the Senate that apply to government responses to committee reports. What we're attempting to do is harmonize the way this committee will respond. The government will respond to this committee as it would respond to any other report from this committee or any other report from any other committee, so that there's some predictability. And also, as the standing orders evolve, which they do, that we would simply always be in line with the standing orders as opposed to having a standalone procedure. That doesn't necessarily add to predictability, nor does it add to the good and strong functioning of the House of Commons or the Senate. So that's why we are attempting to harmonize this with the other reports that would be made to the House of Commons.
Okay, Chair, I suppose the committee will then have to determine ultimately if they want to adopt Mr. Oliphant's amendment or the amendment that I had proposed, or neither. But I will be moving the amendment that I thought I had moved after this one is disposed, if I am able to. The original version of the legislation has a mechanism that prevents the government from using prorogation or dissolution to get around responding to this report. Normally, the process in the standing orders is that the standing orders apply while Parliament is unless a Parliament is dissolved or prorogued, and the original language in the bill says if Parliament is prorogued or dissolved before the response is tabled, the minister must post the response in a prominent location on the website of the Department of Foreign Affairs and within the time referred to in Section 2 regarding the tabling of the response. The response must be tabled as soon as feasible after the commencement of the next session of Parliament. It means that if a committee makes a recommendation, the government does have to provide a response. The amended version would also set out a requirement for the government to be substantive in that response, to provide reasons around their decision. Effectively, this government amendment guts the existing proposal because it simply says the government has to comply with the standing orders. Well, the government has to comply with the standing orders anyways. There's hardly any point in putting this in legislation. It's not about harmonizing anything. It's about removing any substantive effect of this section. And what we would like to see is a meaningful parliamentary trigger that the government can't avoid through prorogation or dissolution that applies regardless. And that gives the committee some flexibility of setting timeline that's urgent. I know there was a concern about the 40-day timeline, whether it's appropriate. My amendment proposes to remove the 40-day requirement and leave it entirely up to the committee to set a timeline that's appropriate under the circumstances. It also proposes to address any concerns about giving information in advance of sanctions that might be coming. So I think the amendment that we were going to propose cleans up those issues. But again, what we're seeing with this amendment is fundamentally a gutting of any substance to the provision, and just the revised version would say the government has to follow the standing orders. So I would encourage the committee to take a stand for an effective parliamentary trigger and to defeat this amendment, and then to subsequently deliberate about the alternative that we'd like to propose. Thank you.
You are correct. In the event G 1.1 is adopted, CPC 4 cannot be moved due to a line conflict, since any given line can only be amended once. Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
Let me be really clear. There is, in fact, there is no intent on our side to circumvent anything to prevent lists, to prevent this activity from happening. What our concern is that we have prorogation is a tool that has been used by successive governments, as dissolution also is the allowance of the people of Canada to speak. That is what happens. And the reality is that we attempt during dissolution to not engage in certain activities. We move into a caretaker government mode, and I think that is something that all of us need to respect because it is part of the parliamentary process. The case I would need to hear is why this is significantly different than every other piece of work done by Parliament. That case has not been made for me, and I don't believe it. This is important work, but so is every other single piece of work that Parliament does. The case needs to be made why this is unusual, why it is different from other pieces of legislation that arrive from private members, from public bills from the Senate, government legislation, why it is different than every other report that is tabled in a response from the government to committees, which are as important as our committee. And that case, I think, needs to be made because I think there's a supremacy being put on this that isn't appropriate and actually belittles the work of other committees and other groups. So if that case can be made, I'm willing to listen to it, but I don't believe it's been made. That's why I think the standing order should prevail, and we should treat this as ordinary parliamentary work that is embedded in our lives and gets done appropriately. A significant issue we have is with the 40 days. We heard from government officials that would be problematic for them. I respect our public servants, and that's why I think we need to listen to them. But that's not the only issue here. It's part of the issue is 120 days is our norm. But generally speaking, we think the standing orders should be followed because every committee follows them. Every parliamentarian is subject to them, and I just believe that that's the way government works better and Parliament works better.
Mr. Jennings.
Thank you, Chair. Just respectfully, I'll respond to a few of the points that were made. Mr. Oliphant said that it's not the intention of the government to avoid this reporting requirement through prorogation or anything like that. And I know there's a lot of curiosity around here about intentions around prorogation, but I won't speculate about that either. The point of this legislation is
Point of order. Some of us lived through the longest prorogation done to save a government.
That was
Mr. Chong and I were there.
That was meant to be lighthearted, Mr. Oliphant, but clearly I failed at being lighthearted. The point is this legislation is designed to be timeless. It's designed to bind governments of all stripes and ensure that any government of any stripe will have the accountability requirements associated with this parliamentary trigger. I think that's important. And in terms of the 40 days, again, I would like to move an amendment that responds to that concern, and I will if I'm able. I think to the question of what's the difference here between the work of other committees. Look, I would be very open to a broader conversation about beefing up the requirement around government responses. I think too often on committee reports we get government responses that are, the government takes note of this recommendation. A government response shouldn't be, we read it, we'll think about it. It should provide some degree of substantive response, and so in this particular case, this provision, if the amendment is defeated, would beef up that requirement. I think there's an argument to be made that could be done in other cases, but there's no reason not to do it in this case. If we simply again gut this as proposed, then we're back to a situation where a committee makes recommendations and the government can say we take note of those recommendations. Well, great. But what we think is important for meaningful accountability is a parliamentary trigger for sanctions, like exists in other jurisdictions, like exists in the United States, for example, where if Parliament thinks it's important enough to say this person should be sanctioned, that the government has to provide a response explaining why they have taken a decision one way or the other, and that response has to be provided. It can't be avoided through prorogation. I think that again makes this a meaningful check on government, and it's one that I think members will find useful regardless of who the minister or who the government is.
Thank you, Mr. Jenis. Mr. Sarai.
I was just wondering if I can ask the officials how they respond to committee reports, so they need to make their best effort to respond comprehensively. Is that something that you have to do?
Sure. Shall I just go, Mr. Chair? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the question. Of course, the department always welcomes, the government always welcomes the discussions of the committees and the parliamentary committees and evaluation and information that is shared with us. When we receive recommendations from committees, of course, we very seriously review them and assess them. Many aspects are taken into consideration. I can speak for sanctions. I mean, these include policy considerations, legal consideration. It includes foreign policy, sometimes discussions with others, as well as the evaluation of whether there's sufficient open source, reliable evidence that we can find on the situation at hand. All these are factored into our responses. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
If I may?
Yes, of course, Mr.
Again, to Madame Langlois. My apologies. In terms of just to follow up on what you mentioned, in terms of the breadth, scope, and robustness of the response you can give to a committee, if we have a 40-day versus a 120-day limit, is there a material difference in terms of the robustness of the response you can give to a committee with respect to quality, thoroughness, etc.?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. The more time, of course, there is, the more time it is helpful to us to find more information. Open source, reliable information can be hard to find in certain circumstances. So the more time there is, of course, the better it is for us in terms of a straight and deep evaluation of the situation at hand. Thank you.
Just to follow up on that, would the committee's response not be like would the committee have would we be missing a lot of elements if you only had 40 days versus 120 days in terms of the response that we need to do our work?
So in certain circumstances, it can be very difficult to find the information, as I mentioned, in terms of what is available. Also in terms of engagement with internal partners in government or outside partners internationally. Having more time is always very useful, and 40 days could be difficult in certain circumstances.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Jenis.
I'll just underline that the amendment that we have put forward already addresses the issue of the 40 days. It already eliminates the 40-day requirement. So that's not an issue. Thank you.
I just want to ask the officials if they have any comments on caretaker government status and what happens during caretaker governments after dissolution, and what goes on during that period and whether it affects this or not.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. From experience, and when there's dissolution, when they're in caretaker mode, every decision is considered and is framed by the convention that applies during that period. So it's difficult for us to do the same breadth of work in terms of ensuring that only those things that are essential go forward.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Jenis.
Yeah, and I would just say briefly on the caretaker government issue, I mean, in particular, foreign affairs is something that has to continue during a dissolution. The foreign affairs minister is still the foreign affairs minister, the government is still the government, and the government has to act and respond to international crises, and that should include the application of sanctions. It therefore should include reporting on sanctions. I think it should be very clear that work has to continue through that period. And again, we don't want to see governments avoid the need to report when asked to by a committee. We think the provision of reasons and the posting of that information on a website in case when those can't be tabled in Parliament is an appropriate accountability measure. But I think the points have been made on this.
Yes, Mr. Oliphant.
I would just add that in my experience, after 2 elections, 2 dissolutions, having been Parliamentary Secretary of Foreign Affairs, when my job stopped immediately the day the election is called because Parliamentary Secretary stopped, the Minister does continue, however, in a very limited fashion. There's firewalls put up all over the place that what ministers can even know during an election period. It's very much a crisis-oriented moment. That's all there is.
Thank you for that. Yes, Mr. McKay.
Just if I may ask the officials how other nations deal with this kind of situation, or do you have any comparators?
If I may ask a clarification on sanctions in terms of evaluation? Certainly. So there's different, of course, as you know, there's different systems across different countries, and the legal basis of those systems will affect how they deal with different discussions on sanctions. In the UK, we understand there's a lot of discussions in Parliament, but as such, parliamentary committees just simply use regular means to express their views to the government, and the government will respond. In the US, the division of power is very different. In that context, bills can be moved by different parts of the legislative and by Congress. So those discussions will vary a lot. When you look at what has been happening over the years, it's often through executive orders by the administration that sanctions decisions are made. In terms of the EU, again, it's complicated by the different levels of intervention in terms of competence, if you like, in terms of the sanctions responsibilities. So in the EU, there is the Commission that deals with external matters and the European Union itself, but there's a big role given to the member states. The member states need to put forward proposals for discussion. It goes through various levels of committees and discussions in the EU. Depending on whether there's trade elements, can go to different committees. So in the end, those discussions are more complex for them, and as they have many members and consensus must be obtained, then you have a process that goes forward through all those committees by consensus and comes in the end with recommendations for decisions. Once sanctions are agreed to in the EU, of course, the implementation goes to the member states. So the member states themselves then have to put in place the sanctions or put the implementation measures in place. So that's an overview generally of our key like-minded partners on autonomous sanctions.
If I may, Chair?
Yeah. Yes, Mr. McKay.
So is there differential binding elements on the nation states of the EU for sanctions packages? So if the European Commission, European Parliament adopts a sanctions package, for instance, it's not clear to me how that package is binding on, say, Germany or Hungary, or is there a separate assumption process?
From what I understand, I can give you a high-level kind of overview, but be happy to follow with more precision if you like after. But from what I understand, so once the sanctions announcements are made or approved by consensus and they're made at the EU level, they are applicable in all the member states. However, in terms of implementation, each member state has to take their own steps in terms of the implementation. This is due to the different types of competence in the EU system, with the external affairs being at the EU level and the implementation domestically. So anything, for example, that would deal with customs measures that need to be put in place would be put in place at the country level, at the member level, rather than across the board. So once there is a decision to impose sanctions, while it is effective for all member states, further steps need to be taken by the different member countries.
I don't wish to prolong this issue, Mr. Speaker, but it is an opportunity. One of the issues that I've been approached upon is the coordination of sanctions. And some countries do this and some countries do that. So we read the headlines, EU adopts sanctions, we'll say Magnitsky sanctions. And the way you're describing it to me is that those individual nation states that constitute the European Union have to individually make decisions to adopt that package of Magnitsky sanctions. What's not clear to me is whether there's holes in that system, and because there's holes in the system, there's holes everywhere else. But I don't want to, as I say, take up the time of the committee, but this is pretty significant because we think that we've done things when in fact we may not have done things. I'll leave you to final comment on that and turn it back to the committee. Sorry, Chair.
In terms of the implementation, yes, it's incumbent on all the member states. How they coordinate there's two levels of coordination. They will do it amongst themselves. You were touching on also in terms of coordination amongst countries, maybe across discussions internationally. So there's that coordination that happens as well, which can take a lot of time in terms of we do try to, as you know, sanctions are the most effective when we move together. So we do try to have discussions to ensure when we have common interests that we can work together to align. So in this case, you would have potentially international discussions amongst Canada, United States, EU members, etc. And then the EU members would themselves kind of regroup and decide on what their best approach is, just like we would do in Canada with other departments in terms of what would be the best Canadian approach. So those different types of levels of discussions do take time, yes.
Thank you.
So we now go to Mr. Sarai before going to Mr. Bergeron. Yes, Mr. Sarai.
Maybe you can tell us, we're I think, thinking or have on our list of things to do a sanction report. Would this type of topic be better discussed and flushed out in a study on the sanction regime itself and how these sanctions could be enabled, how effective they are, what the process of they are, what process can be streamlined better, etc.? If you can elaborate.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we certainly welcome engagement with committees and the discussions. A sanctions report would have to be, in terms of, if I understand what you're describing, would be fairly broad. So would need some number of time to evaluate and assess, and we'd be happy to continue the discussion. We note that the Senate right now is working on its own report and some of its views and recommendations, and we'll be happy to engage in that context or here with the committee if there is an interest in discussing further with sanctions. If it's the broad scope of sanctions from how we make them to all the way to implementation, of course, that would be more in-depth and would take a bit more time from our side, but we'd be happy to do that.
What is the Senate studying right now? What do they have before them?
So the Senate has been working on a review of the sanctions legislation and will be putting forth a report and recommendations later on, timing to be determined, but that should be coming.
So are you suggesting that it would be smart of us to wait for that report to be done? I know it's not in your purview necessarily, but just if you can opine on that.
Sorry, there's a lot of noise. If you could repeat the question, because...
Are you suggesting that we wait for that study to be completed so we can opine on that afterwards? Is that what your suggestion is? And not as a departmental, but just as an individual, if you may want to shed some light on that?
I wouldn't opine. I mean, the report would be forthcoming. I'm not sure what the timing would be. It would certainly be an interesting perspective for us to review, and whether the committee would like to review the report or engage that discussion, I mean, we'll defer to the committee, of course. But from our understanding is the Senate report will be forthcoming.
Mr. Chair, I have been listening very closely to the debate around the table, but I have to say that this proposal for amendment really would eliminate 15 lines from the initial bill, and then would urge us to respect the standing orders of the House and the rules of the Senate. And we have to do that already. So I have to say that this government motion has been presented by the government, and in fact, I am surprised that it was found to be admissible in order. But I think it is intended to make inoperable the initial proposals in the initial bill that were brought forward by the House of Commons. It's just there to make the government feel more comfortable. I will vote against it.
Now being 1 o'clock, I think it's almost time to adjourn. Prior to doing that, I understand Mr. Chong would like to raise an issue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There have been discussions amongst members of the committee, and I believe if you seek it, you will find consent of the committee to first adopt the report that our analysts have written on the committee's travel to Eastern Europe and to Belgium, and that the chair report the same to the House, and that the committee requests a government response to the report.
Thank you, Mr. Chong. I think that's a great idea, should everyone agree. However, as you know, there's a number of different steps we have to take for adoption of that motion. Is there a unanimous consent to adopt the travel report? Excellent. And the report is to be entitled, be adopted, that the report be, so we're perfectly fine with the wake-up call, the world after February 24th, 2022, as the title. Excellent. Okay, next we have to determine that the chair, clerk, and analysts be authorized to make such grammatical and editorial changes as may be necessary without changing the substance of the report. Is that okay with everyone? Excellent. That pursuant to Standing Order 109, the committee requests that the government table a comprehensive response to this report. Is that correct? Yes. Awesome. That dissenting or supplementary, no, I don't think there's any supplementary or dissenting. And that the chair present the report to the House. Correct. Okay. That sounds great. I just wanted to highlight.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
We just add with thanks to our analysts to that motion.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much to the analysts.
Mr. Chair?
Great job. Yes.
Ali?
Yes.
Ali?
1 second.
Just 1 second.
Yeah. When's the deadline for?
26.
Yeah.
April 26.
Where did I put it?
Yes,
Yes, Mr. McKay.
I am not a member of this committee, but I do take note that Vladimir Kara-Murza was sentenced to 25 years. May I plant a thought with the committee that this committee make a statement about what is utterly outrageous sentence, and it is relevant to the entire conversation this committee has had for the last 2 hours. So. Well, I would say discuss it first.
Yes. Do we want a draft statement prepared for next meeting? Excellent. So that's that. So before adjourning, I just wanted to remind all the members that the date to report this particular bill back to the House is Wednesday, April 26, 2023. So on that point, we'll adjourn the meeting. Thank you. Thank you.